Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for attending. I've said it a few times, but this is Andrew speaking, so you know my voice. I'm with the Jones Payne Group. We started this survey with the Florida Airport Council because we thought it'd be a great way to get some information about how things are going in the GIS world, and the FAC offered to be a partner with us so that we could work with a focused group of people, and that gave us a good organization to work with, and Ian was part of that. So I am a principal at the Jones Payne Group. I actually focus on GIS and information management systems. We do many different things for airports, but my personal focus has to do with GIS and technology. So hence the reason I'm sort of in the forefront of this particular effort. And I don't know, Ian, if you want to introduce yourself so people know your voice as well.
My name is Ian McKay. I'm the airport planner for Lee County Port Authority, but I guess I'm serving more in an FAC capacity. I'm the chairman of the Noise and Community Affairs Committee for the Florida Airports Council. We have a lot of airport planners on the committee. GIS isn't my background. My background is aviation and airport management, but I have been working a little bit with GIS, and so teamed up with Andrew here with Jones Payne in pursuit of this survey. So
I'll add that Ian's a great researcher, so it's been a lot of fun kind of digging into things with him and talking about ideas on how we do this. So a couple of housekeeping things in terms of the tool we're using to do the presentation. Right now, the window may not be covering your whole screen, and if you want to do that, at the top of the box, there's a sort of diagonal, multi-directional diagonal arrow that if you hover over, it'll say full screen, and you can get full screen display if that is beneficial. And then there's also a chat window on the right side, or if you go full screen, there'll be a tab at the top that'll let you open a separate chat window. And at any point, if you want to put in a chat, so Greg is here. Greg is just helping out. He'll monitor the chat, as will Ian. And if you have questions and it's easier to type them in rather than speaking up if you're muted, for example, we can certainly answer your questions that way. And access to that effect, if you can mute yourself, that would be great. It sounds like we got a pretty good connection with everybody right now, so hopefully that stays the way it is, but you never know with the phone. And also just to add, I don't know if you all heard that we are actually recording this, and what we're going to try to do at the end is we'll put this up on a private YouTube channel and make it available so that if you want to have other people see it or view it or want to review things later, you can do that. So here's a good example. Steve, if you can hear me, is it possible for you to mute your phone? Or actually get, oh, there you go. Great, thank you. So in terms of the presentation here, I guess we'll get started. And we broke the presentation into these categories you see on the screen, and we really tried along the way to get a lot of insight and hopefully being able to offer some advice. And based on the data and going through the details, we thought these groups would make the most sense. I guess it would be wondering if we should ask people just for their title, if that is reasonable. Also trying to gauge whether or not people want to be interactive or they want me to just keep talking. And my preference would be to have everybody talking and have this a great conversation, but I know that's not necessarily realistic. So maybe, I don't know if we can go around the room. I think we heard from Doug and Nick, who are both on the phone with Ian, Doug Swank, and Nick, I didn't get your last name, but I know you're the new GIS person, analyst there. How about Kent Bontrager? Can you just give us, I don't know if everyone knows you or not. I'm not sure if you can.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, that's great. Ken, if you could just let us know maybe simple things, maybe what your title is and what your airport is.
Yeah, I'm at Sarasota-Bradenton International Airport. Fairly a new hire, but I've taken over the engineering department here. So we have about 5 of us total here.
Okay, great. All right, thanks. And Patricia, I'm just going down the list here in order, so Patricia, if you could do the same. I won't wait too long. All right, we'll come back and try Patricia again if you are struggling with the mute. Richard?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Richard McConnell. I'm with Northwest Florida Beaches International Airport in Panama City, and I'm the deputy director. And between myself and the director, we wear a lot of hats, so we're listening in.
Yep. All right, great. All right. Sean?
This is Sean Blevins with the Gainesville Regional Airport. I'm the airport operations manager here.
Okay, super. And Steve? Steve's muted. I don't know. Oh, there we go.
Steve Johnson. I'm with the City of Ormond Beach, GIS analyst with Ormond Beach Municipal Airport.
Okay, great. And we'll try Patricia one more time. I don't know, Greg, is that us muting Patricia, or is she self-muted? Or maybe they're one and the same because she's connected by computer.
I think she's self-muted.
Yeah, okay. All right, so we'll move on. I don't want to belabor that, but again, just invite everyone. If you want to speak up during the presentation or interrupt me, that's great. No problem at all. All right, so in terms of participation, we initially we intended to focus on smaller GA airports, but we, in talking with the FAC and getting different ideas, we realized that this conversation probably applied just as equally to, I'll say, smaller and larger airports. And so we ended up sort of broadening this up to all FAC members, and we got a reasonable response from a broad spectrum of airports. Actually, general aviation side, we got about 62% here, and just quickly looked up, there are about 60% of the airports in Florida are GA. So we got a reasonable cross-section in what we got for response rate, which I guess makes it easier to analyze the data in some ways. On the commercial side, here's the breakdown. Interesting thing for me here, and this may not be a surprise to all of you, but 2/3 of the respondents in this category have an operating budget of $10 million or greater. So on the commercial side of the respondents, we have a pretty large group of larger airports. And in terms of ownership, the write-ins that are here, we had a state and a town. Town is there. So state and military were the 2 write-ins in this case. And if I just were to go back a little bit, just to offer a little bit of insight, we interpreted the data on the title side. So it actually sounds like the group that is present on the call is a pretty diverse group. I looked at the titles that we had our sort of write-in category and broke it down into four different layers, if I sort of interpreted it correctly. So the idea on my side was that we had the manager-director, sort of airport manager-director position. We have the department manager or the VP layer. There's a project management layer and a specialist layer. So as I talk about positions, those are the 4 layers of hierarchy, and it's sort of rough, and the intent wasn't to be very specific, but it actually sounds like on the call we have directors, we had a department manager, certainly a specialist, and maybe a project manager. I'm not sure if we. So it's just so we know who's on call, but also in terms of who responded. We had very few technical people. So when we first initially sent out the survey, there was a lot of questions back about, am I going to be able to do this survey? And our intent was to actually target more managerial layer. There was nothing wrong with using technical resources to answer the survey. That we didn't want to avoid that, but at the same time, we were most curious about people who have an influential voice or are the people who make the decisions, and that we were hoping would give us a good focus on what the problems or challenges and different kinds of things that are going on. being in the trenches a lot myself, I feel like there are a lot of technical issues, and I could talk all day about those, but my guess is that would get a little bit tedious. So getting into how technology is employed, the intent was, again, a really high-level concept of how airports manage or perform these technical services. And so we, in broad brushstroke matrix here, but the general trend is that these services are on the in-house side. So that first column is showing mostly, or the majority of, or the higher numbers are there, with the exception of CAD services. And we're thinking that that's probably because CAD is a very common deliverable for development projects, right? Architects or planners would deliver CAD documents to you. May actually even be something you get from surveyors. My guess is, I don't know if I can draw on this. I didn't really practice drawing too well, but just going to see. No, I can't do it. All right. So the question here, looking at the outsourced GIS side, I would guess that there is a motivation to have GIS as deliverables. It's something that obviously is happening less, and I'm sort of curious why that may be, and I could take some guesses. But as an observation, I think that was it's probably something we all live through, but I would suspect that we would hope to see that change and evolve and make GIS more deliverable. I certainly, from the consulting side, would say it's a realistic thing for you to expect as a deliverable. And I would hope that you would encourage your projects to include GIS as deliverables, either that through data deliverables or shapefile deliverables and things like that, just like you would ask for architects to give you CAD files or BIM modeling tools. Overall, let's see, the top three here at the bottom are the central repository, managing or having enough staff to really take care of systems, which I think we all know taking care of systems and also taking care of data is quite a challenge. And then also finding money to cover consulting fees, which hardware and software to grow your system or keep it up to date. One note here, the interesting sort of tidbit, I guess, 80% of the GAs that we found were challenged with item number 3 here, finding money for hardware and software and also consultants, but 50% of those same organizations are currently using GIS. So in a way, there are certainly challenges, but it's encouraging that even through these sort of priority obstacles, there's some success going on with GIS at GAs, which is great to hear. Looking at the bottom two, GIS, the central repository and GIS really go hand in hand, that last one there. And I'm wondering or maybe speculating that it's a chicken and egg kind of arrangement or relationship where it would be great if we had a central repository because that would make GIS easy. And then you may also hear that, gee, if we implement GIS, it would make it a lot easier to create a central repository. And I suspect that there are conversations that are going back and forth in that regard, and it can make it tricky to decide which one to do. In terms of, I guess, thoughts on that, I wouldn't say one way or the other is right or wrong, but that the conversations would continue. And I guess the point there would be that GIS really is or should be part of your central repository. That certainly would remain true, regardless of which direction you chose to implement or move forward with a new data repository. Any questions so far? Any thoughts, or I'll keep going? All right. So who was using GIS? And we simplified this to a simple yes/no in order to get a baseline, just a checkbox. So you could be super simple or super sophisticated. Really, I guess the point for us was to determine if there was any GIS going on and I guess it establishes a mindset and a way of thinking that GIS is a tool that you can utilize to make your job either easier or more effective. So we had a pretty good response, and I could round this to say 50%, 47% actually is a really big number. So super great job really on using GIS and using it as a tool within the airports. Within these results, it was actually a very broad range. I can't look at that yes and say, oh, that was specifically this type of airport or this size of airport. It really was a common trend, and it seems like everybody, regardless of how big or small or how you're organized or what your budgets are, GIS is something that everyone is doing, which is great news because I actually think that it's a tool that can really help all levels of organization, whether you're the smallest of small airports or the largest of large airports. There are great ways for you to take advantage of GIS. So for the group that have not implemented, about half of the overall respondents have not implemented GIS yet, and we assume that there's part of your motivation is to really learn more and see whether you can actually use GIS and help solve some problems. So we had some simple questions, but in terms of implementing GIS at airports where you don't have it, about 40%, if I add the two, within 3 years and within 1 year, so about 40% that are not using GIS are planning to implement within 1 to 3 years. And in that group, a high percentage of those were associated with cities or counties. Maybe that's helpful in terms of finding other people that are in your same boat in terms of being a partner with a city, partner with a county. And actually, we'll talk a little bit, it'll come up a couple of other times, but the county relationships do seem different than city relationships in terms of the kind of data you have access to and what kind of resources are available to you. So, but anyway, one of the things, and I'll try to continue to do this in terms of isolating or trying to look for common needs among the respondents. So I'll try to give you those insights as we go. And let's see. There we go. So back to the 47% that are already using GIS. This year, so over 30% have been using GIS for a really long time, over 10 years. A surprise to me, interestingly, was that 80% of that group, that bottom line that is more than 10 years, were GA airports. So it seems like GA, regardless of whether they're sophisticated or complicated, they actually have been, say, investing or utilizing GIS as a tool for quite a long time. Looking at satisfaction with GIS systems, overall, the majority of everyone said that they were either moderately, very, or just generally satisfied, which is great news that the GIS is working and serving a need. Within that moderately dissatisfied group, there were really that group is represented by the new systems, so systems that are less than 1 year old, and systems that are greater than 10 years old. So it's the really old systems or the really new systems that are in that moderately dissatisfied. So I guess if you're just getting started, the good news is that once you get your feet on the ground and you get going, the chances are you're probably going to end up serving needs and it should work out. If you're at the tail end and you've been using GIS for a long time, you may want to talk to some of your peers that have been doing it for a shorter period of time and learn what they're doing to provide resources because they're having good success doing what they're doing. Let's see. In terms of departments that utilize GIS, so we realize maybe not all airports are organized exactly this way, but we generally broke the basic sort of operational or categories of how we see airports functioning. And in terms of the first two columns, if you add the percentages together for most of these groups, or all but one, were up around 75% of these groups. So engineering, facilities management, operations, and planning are all up at or above 75% usage for a combination of making maps, doing analysis, and also providing view access. The interesting one was environmental. That's really on the map making and analysis side, but there really isn't a whole lot of viewing. Not sure why that is. I'm not sure if it's just the data is not interesting, or maybe a majority of that data isn't necessarily inside the fence kind of thing. Perhaps environmental extends beyond the fence, and it's not on people's sort of thought process or radar screen. So we're not exactly sure what the reasoning is behind that. Okay, so how do airport staff access GIS? The majority here is desktop applications. I guess that makes perfect sense for small organizations where you have a single license for a desktop. That desk is manned by a person who has the GIS skill, and whenever someone needs a map or some analysis or something done, they'll go to that resource and ask for help. Again, I guess that makes perfect sense in a smaller organization where there's less opportunity for a, say, department or to actually include GIS skill sets within other departments. I think that's the ideal scenario, is to have people within each department. If I go look at this previous slide, looking at engineering, environmental, facilities, if you have a resource within each of those groups that understand that domain and are there day to day, but also have a GIS skill, that's kind of the optimal or ideal scenario. But again, obviously, if you're a small organization, it may not be realistic in any way, shape, or form. So looking at these groups related to servers, because in what I do a lot of work with web-based GIS, and that tends to be, or really is necessary to have a local server or a web server. And so if I'm looking at the top line there, the outsourced server versus the local server, currently obviously the local server here is showing a dominance. And one of the things we talked about in thinking about this is whether or not a tool like Esri's ArcGIS Online as a product, which is, I'm not sure if I do it justice, but describing it as a kind of turnkey web-based mapping tool that doesn't require you to have any infrastructure. You include that in your licensing, you gain access, and you can build maps without having all that infrastructure. So we're not sure if we're going to see the movement of local servers to outsource servers, or if thinking about security and the sensitivity of data, and whether there is a willingness to move those servers out of the airport firewall or not. So again, I think cost-wise, there's probably a lot of motivation. And Ian, I don't know if you have any insights just in your current experience on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the airport industry, the trend is definitely going to move towards the outsourced server, like you said, the ESRIs, GIS Online's kind of the way of the future, and moreover for relatively affordable price. And I know that that's totally varies depending on the budget and the size of the airport, but just having nothing but desktop applications, the only people who are going to be able to use GIS are people who are technically proficient with it, whereas moving that data and those capabilities to an outsourced server, something a little easier in a web browser, is going to open up GIS to virtually, an entire organization enterprise-wide, as opposed to, having one person. So, for the purposes of tinkering with data or deliverables that you get from a consultant and eventually plan to put up on the FAA's AGIS, you're going to be using a desktop application. The people who are going to be touching that are going to be technically proficient, but one of the things that I think the industry should be taking advantage of is getting more deliverables in a GIS format rather than just CAD, you know what I mean? Because ultimately, like we're probably going to talk about a little bit later, is that there's a lot of utility in doing that. That data, you know, doesn't necessarily go away when you receive it. So, you know, why not spin off some of the projects that you're doing as an airport and take advantage of those, collect that data, you know, fund it through AIP or however, and put it on an outsourced server, you know. Even if you're a smaller airport and you don't necessarily have staff in-house that can do that, certainly your consultant would probably be willing to do that for you for a nominal price, you know. So what's interesting, I think, about this particular slide is that ideally in the industry, you know, I would prefer to see it flip-flop, where your desktop application is kind of on the lower end of respondents, and a vast majority of people who would respond to this survey, say 10 years from now, are going to be using something that's more widely accessible and requires, you know, less technical skill level. So.
Yeah, and actually the right in here I'm remembering now was actually mobile. So some people are actually deploying mobile maps as well, which I guess is related to what Ian's saying, where you have that simple, really easy to use or focused method of accessing the data, and phones or tablets certainly will enter this mix as well. But I think with all of that, the server is necessary, and I would encourage everybody who does any GIS at all to really look closely at the server options, whether it's local, whether it's outsourced, or we'll talk a little bit about open source options as well. It may seem really intimidating or feel complicated on the first look at it, but the reality is that if you do take the steps of getting a server going and do, you know, house your data, even if it's just GIS data and not really intended to be integrated with other services, it can simplify your desktop applications as well. So it makes it easier to manage that desktop and to retrieve data from a central location rather than a file structure. So moving GIS from desktop to desktop, and then obviously, as we've been talking, spinning out web services and really making that data broadly more available becomes much easier. So even if you're just using desktop GIS at this point, I often will say really seriously consider working with a server anyway. It'll open doors and it'll make your life easier. I know it doesn't look that way when you see it on paper, but I promise it'll feel that way eventually. In terms of vendors, we've talked a lot about Esri, and I think everybody probably has heard that name whenever you talk about GIS, and it's certainly the dominant product within the United States. They work with many different industries, aviation being one of their key focuses, but also cities, and I guess we could sort of mix city and county into one bucket for Esri, where they offer very specialized tools that service that industry. And so given that a number of airports are operated by cities or counties, there's some connection there with Esri. Google Earth, I was actually surprised to see the quantity of respondents who are using Google, either Map or Earth. I think that's a great thing. Our guess is that Google Earth is free, it's easy to use, it gives you access to free aerial imagery, and it also lets you do basic overlays or do your own, I'll say, simplified drawing on top of it. So it offers a great basic foundational layer of resources that comes at a very low cost or no cost. In terms of thinking about enterprise, Google Earth requires the use of KML formats. There are a couple of other formats that it works with, but and it's okay if you don't know what KML is. I guess the point is that it's different than an Esri format, for example. And so managing the shuffling between the two, some servers can get in the middle and make that a little bit easier, but as you grow and get more sophisticated, managing symbology or colors and patterns and things that you establish in a KML format can be a little bit more difficult. So I think I would recommend everybody use Google Earth. It's a great product and a great tool, and an easy way to distribute. Can also distribute web services from a server thinking about long-term and growing larger and bigger, if your organization is going to evolve, Google Earth's usage will probably dwindle a little bit, and you'll turn more to other web services and desktop applications as well. Let's see, GIS software licensing fees. This one we actually generally seeking either it's reasonable, sort of fitting in people's budget, or they're not paying fees. And the people who are not paying fees are 75% of those respondents are actually county. So county-run airports are managing a licensing arrangement at the county level, most likely that is providing access to GIS through a different budget, which obviously is a great advantage to those organizations. Not sure, well, some cities may be doing that as well, but beyond city and county, I think the list of management structure, I guess I could say, or how that works is you're kind of on your own in terms of licensing, but it sounds like the cost of that is not a major problem specific to licensing. Let's see, integration to CAD. So we've talked actually a little bit about CAD already, and that's probably overwhelmingly a really common thing that everyone is familiar with. And GIS, being a spatial platform, lends itself to working well with CAD. I, in no way, shape, or form, expected this number to be as high as it is, at 81%. That's a huge number, and I think it's a great sign. One of the most challenging things about bringing GIS to an organization that doesn't already have it is to change the thinking, or at least allow parallel thinking in the GIS world, which is very different than a CAD world. So CAD is very structured and very specific to the built environment. GIS is spatial in a similar way, but it's much more on a macro scale, a very big area and very, very big thinking. You still use the same kind of terminology like layering and which of you do in CAD, but it's not a one-to-one conversation. And particularly with people who have spent, say, the first part of their career focused on CAD, it could be a really difficult transition to shift to GIS. Because GIS is more, how do I say this? I don't want to dig myself into a hole. GIS tends to be more about analytics and relationships and presenting data and really understanding data, where CAD really has a focus on communicating a message about a very technical topic. And I don't know if that sorted it out for anybody, but the GIS world isn't the kind of place where you necessarily think, oh, I'm going to go to GIS and start drawing different parts of my airport. It's really unlikely that that would be the process. But and I'm guessing here, it's probably very likely that you would take your CAD files, convert them to a spatial format, and pull them into a GIS system and utilize that as a background layer to start locating things like door tags or smoke detectors or valves for your heating systems and whatever else. I think we have a list of thoughts about that later. So it's just a different mindset, I guess, is my point. And for me, I'm excited to see that there's this kind of integration going on. We don't really have any insight in terms of what that integration is, whether it's simply, as I just described, kind of a process of on-demand. When I need a CAD file in a spatial world, I'll pull it into GIS and work with it. There are certainly the other end of this spectrum is to say, well, yeah, we have a completely automated integration system between our CAD files and our GIS system, because for larger airports or maybe a organization that has CAD skill, they may focus on keeping that CAD skill doing what it does really well and has done really well for a long time, but they also want to take care of GIS or take advantage of GIS. And being a different platform, there are pumps or, I don't know, describe syncing tools that will actually integrate the two on the back end but it requires a huge amount of coordination between CAD layering systems and GIS layering systems, translating the data and making sure they all work together. Those things do work, but they're very sophisticated, kind of sort of way above or beyond what a small airport really would benefit from. The investment's not worth it. But anyway, I think it's an interesting conversation for me because that's one of the hardest parts in a lot of cases of getting your internal culture to evolve and to think more about GIS and really starting to understand it. You can get a lot of resistance from people who do CAD all day where they just don't quite grasp the benefit of having GIS or maybe see it as a threat to what they do currently. So that's a cultural thing that definitely comes up in working with different organizations. In terms of data, so we briefly talked about this a little bit, and who we're sharing with, it's really great to see that 80% are saying we're sharing data within our organization. I bet if you asked that question 5 years ago, it would be really small. So there's been a huge evolution, and certainly the thinking on the security and sensitivity of data is evolving quite a bit, and there are definitely still ongoing decision-making about what should be available internally, what should be available publicly. We didn't ask, well, I guess public is here, and sorry, we did ask about public, and that number is small, and my guess is we'll probably see that grow. Certainly in the city environment or, yeah, it's probably large cities, there's this open data initiative concept that is very prominent in a lot of conversations about how to run cities. And just in my career, I've seen airports following the patterns of cities, particularly in the GIS world, probably trailing by about 2 years. So if you're not talking about open data initiatives, you probably will be in the near future. And it's really all about leveraging your data. If you share it, what can you gain by other people utilizing it? And it's not necessarily something that you have to invest in beyond just making it available. And sort of like if we make it, they will come. And cities are experiencing some of that and realizing that it can be a great benefit to how to organize and run your organization. And so it certainly doesn't apply to all your data, but most likely there'll be parts of your data that'll be really beneficial to share. Looking at the FAA line there, floating in somewhere around 40%, we obviously, I think probably all could guess the FAA would love that to be 100%. And that's part of the motivation for us having this, doing the survey at all and trying to get a sense on what's going on in the evolution or the adoption of FAA requirements. In terms of data going out, data coming back in, where you get your data from. So once again, the counties are super good at this, and we would assume that counties, well, knowing counties within Florida are the ones who manage parcel data and property data, things like that, it certainly makes it easy for them to share with those organizations that they manage. But I also, my experience with counties has been that they're very open and able to, very capable across the state of Florida and willing to talk about data relationships. Contrasting that with cities, looking behind the data here, it appears that there are a lot of airports that are sharing data with cities. There's a lot of data going out towards cities, but not a whole lot of data coming back from cities. I'm actually not positive whether that's just because city data is less relevant to airports and you just don't need the kind of data they're managing, or if there's some sort of challenge in terms of understanding why airports would need city data. So I'm not positive about that. I could talk a little bit more. How are we doing on time? I don't want to go too far. I could talk a little bit more about data relationships, but I guess just a couple of bullet points to think about in terms of receiving data and data relationships and actually sending data as well. Data can be hard to find, so in addition to the layers that we listed here, the other category, one of them was the utility companies, which actually is a really great source of data. If you've been looking for any city data, you'd be surprised at what kind of data utilities actually maintain beyond just an inventory of houses. It can be a really great source. They may not be willing to share, but they certainly have data, so it's worth trying. And data sharing relationships can be a little tricky, and there's probably a whole conversation there, but also in terms of what you get for data and whether or not it's useful when you get it is another part of the challenge. So it's not as easy as just saying, oh great, you have parcel data and I can just pull that into my side and work with it. That data evolves, so you have to think about, do I update that data at some point? What's the best way to organize it in a way that I can continue to use it over time and it doesn't fall out of date? I certainly don't want to maintain or invest in maintaining other people's data. So there's a whole layer of things that make this a little tricky. But again, I think going forward and getting back to what I was saying about open data initiatives, I think we're going to see more and more of this, and it's going to become more normal and easier, hopefully, in the practice as well. So specific to implementing GIS and challenges or issues that airports face, let's see, number 2 here, compliance with the FAA, very important, 64.7, and the next one down, improving data accuracy and versioning and maintenance, as well as standards, equally high, 70.6%. We're thinking that those actually, it's not a coincidence. That's something that the FAA is pushing for, highly accurate data, and organizations are feeling the pain of, well, how do I do this, and where do I put it, and how do I keep track of it and maintain it, because I'm being required to. So we are assuming that's not just a casual relationship. There is probably a connection between those two being the highlights in this chart. Ian, do you want to add anything to that particular conversation?
You know, nothing other than just, to me it makes sense. I mean, like you said, I think that there's a commonality between the two, especially on the FAA side. I know, we've discussed at other times, kind of on a high level, that the ultimate goal, I think, for the FAA is to switch over to this new airports GIS kind of EALP dynamic, where airports are managing, their airport layout plans and any kind of projects and changes and things like that electronically. And similarly, the FAA is also moving to a navigational system that's strictly GPS based. So a lot of the VORs, NDBs, and ILS approaches are kind of going away, and your area navigation, GPS kind of LPV approaches are coming in, and that benefits particularly small airports, in my opinion, small as well as large. So, I think in an effort to kind of pave the way for these new approach procedures, FAA wants to get lots and lots of obstruction data, pretty much data on the entire airport environment. They've already shown us that in a number of ways, several memorandums that they've published in the last year or two, requiring airports to provide information on their 20-to-1 approach surfaces for TERPs and so on. So it's not going away. And I guess just to add to that, I attended an airspace roundtable in Tampa a few months ago, and AGIS was a huge topic of discussion. In fact, one of the keynote speakers at this roundtable is Robert Bonani, and he's FAA guy, works up in Washington, D.C., actually runs Airports GIS, and he was kind of talking about how the FAA ADOs are really going to be pushing airports towards AGIS, particularly the ones that stand to benefit from that. So I guess for everyone on the phone call, just something to be mindful of, you know, and which I think that the respondents of this survey are very mindful of, which is why, you know, you see almost 70% for both of these. It's coming, not really going away, so I think people are seeing that.
And Ian, just to add to, or I guess I'll steal your story that you told to me, which you, as an example, an enterprising person within the Lee County Airport, and you say, gee, it would be great if we had location data on our lighting system. And if we knew where that stuff was, we could be more efficient in how we maintain it, or in a crisis situation where we need to fix things, we can use that location data to really guide and direct people. So you take it upon yourself to go out there, take a modest quality GIS sensor, or I'm sorry, GPS sensor, collect some location data, build a GIS layer within your system, and say, this is really a great tool for us as an airport. But you turn around then and say, well, that's part of something that the FAA wants from us. They're going to look at the quality of that data and say, it's plus or minus 5 meters. That's really not useful to us at all. And so I'm thinking there's, I don't want to call it a conflict, it's just a different layer of interest. You can satisfy a whole lot of your internal needs without the high level of accuracy that the FAA is looking for. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that story for me, Ian, stood out as I'm sure that if you're not already in that boat, you probably will end up in that boat at some point in the future. And I don't know if you live in the GIS world, metadata is something that everybody talks about. It's sort of like CADs and layering standards. Keeping track of what the accuracy level of the data you collect is, just so that you know, because when people see it on a GIS system, they think, oh, this is accurate. I can use this to build my new building, or we're going to dig holes or do other things that could be really catastrophic if things aren't where they're supposed to be. And if you're not using metadata to identify that, and that's the boring side of GIS, and the part that everybody, like any other industry where you deal with metadata and standards, it gets boring, but it becomes really important. But I think if you haven't already collected what I'll call lower quality GPS data, you probably will do that because it can be really beneficial, and it can be very inexpensive. You can do it in-house. You don't need sophisticated equipment or anything crazy to satisfy the needs of what you have internally. But when it comes to the FAA requirements, you may end up recollecting that data in a different way. All right, so looking at expanding the capacity, so if you're doing GIS and you want to grow things, we've already seen that licensing costs, specifically licensing costs, are not really an issue. But beyond licensing the software, there's obviously development costs, there's implementation costs, there's maintenance, both of the systems and the data, and all of those things probably mean skilled staff and or consulting to make that happen. So looking at this layer in terms of how to fund it, so the top one is we have no plans. The bottom one is we're not really sure. The middle two, if I add those, somewhere between 30 and 60%, because you may fall in both categories. So 30 to 60% plan to use a combination of local funds versus AIP funds. And local is kind of a generic term. I think what we probably should have said is non-AIP funds. What we mean is, or the way I took this, and it's probably a limitation on the usefulness of the data, but the thinking was money that you control and don't rely on, say, grants or the FAA or other layers to control that money. But anyway, there's an equal amount of people paying locally out of your own funding versus tying it to AIP projects. So we specifically asked about AIP funding and made these the only two options because if you don't know, and I'm guessing most people do know this, but if you don't know, GIS is definitely something that you can connect to an AIP grant request. The general measuring stick, and this is actually in the AIP handbook, you can, any GIS tool, and this goes for any computer system, not just GIS, but GIS tools that are helpful in managing or delivering the project are AIP eligible. So if you haven't had that conversation with your ADO and you have projects coming up, you probably should do that, and at least to just explore whether you want to or not. You may get some insight in terms of what their appetite is for talking about it, but also know that within the AIP handbook there is a specific way for you to include GIS, and this could be deliverables, which is what we were talking about earlier in terms of shapefiles or GIS data, but it also could mean that you have to increase the number of desktop licenses you have and buy some hardware, get some skills, or it's best by having an in-house server or subscribing to an out-of-house server. Those kinds of things are all within the realm of possibility, and it may take some creative sort of discussions on your part with your ADO, but I think, and generally my experience has been the ADOs are very open to any kind of tools that are going to help the project move forward and be successful. I have a long list of different ideas from people here. Okay, all right, I'm going to keep going because we're getting a little short on time. In terms of open source, so I mentioned we'd cover this briefly. So we wanted to talk about open source because I'm just curious or interested to see if it was on anyone's radar. Again, looking outside of the aviation world, open source GIS is becoming more and more common. We're seeing a lot of other countries actually investing pretty heavily in open source tools in addition to the Esri tools. So a very small group currently is actually using open source, and this wasn't specific GIS of any kind. So there may be, within this I'm not sure group, there may be a chunk of people that don't really realize that there are open source servers or other kinds of things going on. So I guess generally here it's currently a pretty small piece of the pie. But in this sort of why we were sort of fishing for, are there trends in terms of what might be the obstacles to, or what the thinking is when you hear about open source solutions? Really not any surprises. My sort of takeaway from this is, yeah, it's just sort of unclear. People don't really know for sure what open source is, or how you get support, or how you actually hire a consultant to work with it. So that it's still in that sort of area of unclear. Personally, I look at open source tools as a great gateway to GIS. I think they can, the options that are available can really get you from GIS desktop tools to server-based tools in a pretty reasonable fashion. And when you have the servers, we talked a little earlier about opening the door to web integration and web access. So, and I'm sort of borrowing from what I'm seeing in other industries and sort of these patterns. So all things being equal, open source options can offer access to an advanced layer of features that might be difficult to get access to in your current licensing environment or your current structure. So I don't want to belabor it. I just want to get the point across that I think open source is something that should be thought about, particularly for really small organizations. It can give you some quick, easy tools. I often talk about open source toasters, where it's a pre-configured box that does magic things, and you don't necessarily need to know too much about what it's doing or how it's doing it. And obviously these concerns that are on the screen, the write-in, one of the key write-ins was security, which we did not include in our list, but that's obviously another concern. And but I wanted to make open source part of the conversation because I think there's more and more relevance and certainly a lot of sophisticated tools available in that world as well. Okay, so working with data. So we talked a little bit earlier about GIS and the central data store and integration with different systems, and I think it's hard to talk about GIS without talking about integration. So in collecting some ideas about what other kinds of data airports are managing, starting at the bottom here, work order management and property management, certainly super common. I'm trying to think of Maximo and off the top of my head, I can't remember the other one. Very common tools to see, kind of turnkey or easy to, trying to think of terminology that makes sense. But to implement these and have them self-contained and functioning within your property management or maintenance teams is pretty straightforward. I don't want to make it sound easy, but the industry is actually good at it, I guess, maybe I say it that way. And so looking at the third one here, leasehold management, I took a little bit of a look behind this to see who was doing this, and it actually tends to be general aviation airports are actually the majority of the respondents doing leasehold management. Our guess is that leasehold is a key revenue component of smaller airports, and it so therefore takes a higher priority. Lesson to the larger airports, I would suggest you talk to the little guys because they've got a secret that you probably could learn from. I bet there's some really great, simple, easy to use ideas about how to do leasehold management within a GIS system that can serve needs and get you going. So it's not always the little guys learning from the big guys, I guess, is my point there. So in this category, looking at currently doing data collection or will be doing so, of those in the CS category, it's a ratio of 1/3 GAs, 2/3 commercial. So the commercial service airports are doing or planning to do more data collection than the smaller airports. The common trigger, or what we saw in the comments, was that the master plan was probably the largest contributor to the motivation on why these data collection activities are happening. And that certainly ties with the FAA's needs as well, and their sort of future or ongoing requirements on what are deliverables to them in terms of your airport layout plan. And complying with the FAA standards is certainly a push from the FAA. Ian talked a little bit about this earlier with the ELP and RNAV. And if you don't know 5318B, it wouldn't surprise me at all. I am intimately familiar with all 500 pages of it, and it's an enormous amount of data standards and deals with both GIS as well as CAD. But that's really where the FAA has spelled out exactly what the standards are in terms of the data requirements. There are not any clues there about how you do it in terms of physically making these things happen and managing and maintaining that data at your airport. And that's certainly probably the biggest challenge. What they're trying to do is give you the deliverable requirements, but it's an exhaustive, detailed, and probably well thought through list of requirements that apply to both CAD and GIS. So in terms of the GIS requirements, they're safety critical, and this next slide, non-safety critical. Both of these, I'll flip back and forth here, but they're both sort of about the same. 50-50 are saying that you're aware of these requirements. And what we found is that the larger your airport operating budget was, the more likely you were to know about these. But at the same time, I would say that these, given the FAA push, again, what Ian was talking about earlier, the FAA's push is to move everyone towards these data requirements. So as a smaller organization, you're going to find that the FAA is motivated to get you to collecting data. In terms of understanding what these requirements are, pretty good idea. So 60-40 here in terms of having some sort of understanding, whether that's basic or understanding them very well. The group here was interesting. The group here that had the understanding, that responded, were all airport managers. So I'll say this right: airport manager / director or department managers. So very high-level people within the airport are saying, I have a very good understanding to at least a limited understanding of what the FAA is asking for. All of the technical people, technical meaning specialists, that was the term I used earlier to sort of group those four layers of hierarchy. All the project managers and the technical people are in the purple here, in the group that don't really know what the FAA is asking for. So it was kind of an interesting surprise on the data side that we ran into the higher level, and it makes me ask a couple of other questions, which I'll get into in a second. But I'm not sure that maybe there's not a benefit to having the technical resources understand this initially until you're committing your airport to doing these things. And so maybe there's some of that, and it'll trickle down eventually. So certainly that most likely will be the case. But the question is how and when and what are the obstacles. Specific to GIS-related compliance activities, the majority here are unsure, but comparing this group, let's see, we looked at the layer of this group that are unsure, have limited understanding of the FAA GIS requirements, are the same people that are responding here and saying we're not doing any, or we're not sure if we're going to be doing any GIS-related compliance activities. So there's definitely a connection between those that don't have an understanding and those that are not planning. I guess that makes sense. I guess the highlight there would be if you're in the group of no or not sure, it's probably something you would want to at least start thinking about. Doesn't mean that you will all of a sudden realize, oh, I've got something to do, but it's definitely relevant in a lot of cases. And I guess we touched a little bit on this earlier as well, but in terms of the FAA saying we want you to comply and we want electronic data, and the natural assumption would be that that would be a mutual benefit, right? The FAA says, I need you guys to deliver GIS, so if you guys build it and give us what we want, you can also use those same tools and use them within your airport. And that's definitely not what's happening. Everybody's not lined up and saying we're super excited about complying with the FAA and we think it's going to be a great initiative. And that I don't get the sense that that's what's going on. So in teasing apart and thinking through this, what we talked a little bit earlier about is data accuracy. My initial guess would be that the data requirements that the FAA has are not in alignment with the data requirements that you see as being beneficial to airports. So at an infrastructure level, which we talked about, maybe using some AIP grant funding to try to help you build GIS systems and implement servers and other things, that's probably a win-win on both sides. That gives you a funding mechanism to be able to build some infrastructure. The FAA then can feel like they've supported you in this initiative. But when it comes to the data side, I'm guessing that the thought of increasing the amount of data that you house isn't necessarily a bad thing. But as we all know, when you have data, somebody has to take care of it. And that's when we start talking about liabilities and cost. What does it take? What kind of effort does that take? So, again, thinking back about airport directors, department managers, so the head of operations or other departments are saying, we get what the FAA is basically talking about. We have an understanding in some fashion of what they want from us, but going back to an earlier slide, we only have about 40% of people actually sharing data with the FAA, and I'm guessing that probably less than all of those are submitting data not specific to EALP. So we're at a level of 40%, probably less, talking about EALP, and we had some conversations about why that might be and what's sort of the obstacle. So is it just a matter of time that the FAA is going to get what they want, and it's just a matter of working through the process and trickling down and getting everybody on the same page, or are there unseen reasons why airports are resisting? Why is this thought of as something that's hard to do, or it's a can of worms that we don't want to get into? We're actually at the end of the presentation. This gets us to the last slide here. So sort of that last thought on my part is any thoughts or thinking about what the FAA can do to encourage us to move towards compliance? I think it's a big elephant in the room, and I'm assuming that these conversations are happening everywhere, and it's not that the FAA is trying to be difficult or hard. They're trying to achieve, obviously, the next gen and have some great goals and conservation goals and other things that that make the data obvious why they need it, but at the same time it becomes a challenge or a burden, or the way things are talked about. There's not a ton of enthusiasm every day about I can't wait to deliver my EALP, and so not sure why that is, and it's certainly part of the conversation. So in terms of following up on this, just a couple of housekeeping things, or I don't know if anybody has anything they want to add, comments, if we want to have conversation. I guess I'll pause for a sec if anybody wants to chime in.
Yeah, let's open it up for questions. I'm sure there's probably a few out there. Everyone might be muted now, but does anyone have any questions on the presentation, what they've seen so far, or their experiences so far, their observations, et cetera?
I guess to add to that too, if there are other things that you would hope to hear or that you thought might come out of this data that you didn't hear, certainly willing to go back and take another look at some of the data and do some follow-up discussions or emails about some particulars if you didn't hear something that you thought you might. Okay. We've got the silent group. That's okay. In terms of next steps for us, we do have a profile report. So one of the, oh, did somebody, Richard, were you going to ask a question? Here we go. Okay.
I muted Sean.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he was going to try to ask a question. Sorry, Sean, if you were hoping to ask a question, we got a ton of feedback there. But Richard, I don't know if you just unmuted yourself if you had a question.
No, I just reduced the page back from full screen.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. I just don't want to miss anything. So in terms of follow-up, we did create or we will create a profile report as well for those that requested it, and we'll send those out. Those are more individually focused and comparing your answers to the overall survey. So the overall layout and general structure is similar to the report that you should already have from the download that we provided, but it'll focus a little bit more on your particular airport. So those will be personal one-on-one emails to the survey respondents. And again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to email me or call me. And I'm sure, Ian, you would probably say the same thing. And we'd be happy to continue the conversation or provide any other ideas or thoughts. We can see what we can do to help. We're continuing to talk with the FAC, so we, meaning both Ian and I, are continuing to try to keep this conversation going, and we're not sure what our next event or discussion about this will be, but we're hoping to have some more announcements in the future as well. So I guess I'll say thank you to everybody for going through that, and hopefully it was a good amount of information, and there are some more conversations to be had.
Yep, thanks everybody. So I'm sure most of you are probably a part of FAC. We're kind of looking at going that direction possibly for the next specialty, so I just wanted to put that out there. I'll probably be doing something along the lines of GIS for the NACA, so